Ethan Carter had never imagined that the sprawling, sun-dappled acres of his family's ranch would someday be the battleground for a war waged by bureaucracy. A decorated military veteran, with a heart as big as the sky above his land, Ethan had left behind the chaos of city life to restore what his ancestors had built. Every fence, every weathered barn, and every winding trail held a story, and his was no different. This ranch wasn't merely property. It was a sanctuary, a repository of memories, and a legacy to preserve. On a crisp autumn morning, as the golden light spilled over fields of tall grass and wildflowers, Ethan walked the perimeter of his ranch. The air was cool and filled with promise, yet a sense of foreboding had begun to seep into the peaceful rhythm of his life. In the distance, a sleek, black car idled near the entrance, a harbinger of the conflict to come. At the helm of that car was Karen Pritchard, the self-appointed guardian of community standards and president of a local homeowners association. Karen had built her reputation on an ironclad adherence to rules. Rules she enforced with a fervor bordering on fanaticism. Clad in perfectly pressed blouses and sensible shoes, she projected an air of entitlement that left little room for compassion. For Karen, every detail mattered, from the angle of a hedge to the brightness of exterior lighting. And today, her target was Ethan's cherished ranch. As Ethan reached the weathered wooden gate, a relic he had painstakingly restored, a crisp envelope caught his eye, tacked to the bulletin board that had once welcomed visitors. The document, emblazoned with the HOA seal, was not the warm greeting he had grown accustomed to. Instead, it was a final warning concerning exterior modifications that, according to Karen, marred the aesthetic integrity of the community. The notice cited obscure clauses, none of which Ethan had ever seen enforced before. Ethan's pulse quickened. "I built this ranch with my own 2 hands," he murmured, recalling long afternoons spent repairing the barn and mending fences. "This place is my legacy." But Karen's notice left no room for discussion. The language was clinical and uncompromising. Fines, potential legal action, and threats of restricted access to the property were all laid out in unyielding black and white. That very afternoon, as Ethan sat on the sagging porch of his ranch house, its faded paint a testament to years of love and labor, a knock sounded at the door. There, standing stiffly in a suit and armed with a clipboard, was Karen herself. With an expression that blended self-satisfaction and stern resolve, she explained that Ethan's recent improvements, a set of powerful security lights installed to protect his property, had disrupted the community's harmony. "Mr. Carter," she began in a tone that brooked no dissent, "the HOA rules are clear. Any deviation from approved guidelines is subject to immediate corrective measures." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I've lived by every law and regulation since the day I set foot on this ranch. I never asked for your interference, Karen. My lights aren't a threat, they're a necessity." Her smile was thin and cold. "Your personal needs do not override community standards. This is not a debate, Mr. Carter. It's a matter of compliance." The tension was palpable as the two locked eyes. A veteran with a lifetime of hard-won independence, and a self-appointed arbiter of suburban perfection. In that first confrontation, what began as a simple matter of exterior design morphed into an inescapable battle of wills. Karen's unwavering belief in her own authority stood in stark contrast to Ethan's deep-rooted commitment to his heritage. Neither was willing to yield, and in that charged moment, the seeds of a full-blown conflict were sown. As dusk approached and shadows lengthened over the ranch, Ethan realized that the issue was no longer about a few stray bulbs or an overzealous HOA president. It was about defending his right to access, enjoy, and preserve a piece of land that represented everything he held dear. And somewhere deep within him, a resolve began to crystallize. If Karen and her board would treat his home like a nuisance, then he would fight, not just for himself, but for every soul whose sanctuary was threatened by unreasonable rules. Thus, as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, the stage was set for a showdown that would not only test Ethan's mettle, but would also challenge the very essence of community governance. The ranch, with all its sprawling beauty and storied past, had unwittingly become a crucible for a battle between individual freedom and the oppressive reach of an HOA determined to control every facet of life. The morning after that fateful confrontation, Ethan awoke to a foreboding silence. No birds sang, and the wind itself seemed to hold its breath as if anticipating the next move in a conflict that had already escalated. When he stepped out onto the porch, a new and unmistakable sight met his eyes. A thick envelope, sealed with the HOA's crest, was pinned to the door. With trepidation, Ethan unfolded the letter to find an official fine of $750 for violating community exterior regulations. The language was unambiguous and draconian, leaving no doubt that the HOA intended to make an example out of him. Karen, ever the enforcer of the rules, wasted no time in making her presence felt. That very afternoon, as Ethan examined the fine's details, a black sedan rolled slowly to a stop by the entrance. Two individuals in crisp uniforms stepped out, a pair of inspectors dispatched by the HOA. Their arrival was swift and their purpose clear: to inspect every inch of the property for additional infractions. On the driveway, under the glare of the noonday sun, Karen emerged. Her posture was rigid, her arms crossed in a display of self-assured authority. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "I trust you've received our notice. The rules apply to everyone equally. I expect full compliance." Ethan's jaw tightened as he met her gaze. "I'm well aware of the regulations," he replied evenly. "I even consulted local zoning laws, and it turns out your interpretation is questionable." Karen's smile was sharp, as if honed for moments like these. "Questionable, Mr. Carter? The guidelines have been in place for years. I'm merely ensuring that every resident conforms to the standard we've set." Her words dripped with superiority, as though she believed herself to be the sole guardian of communal aesthetics. But as the inspectors began their meticulous survey of the ranch, examining the placement of the lights, the design of the fence, even the arrangement of wildflowers along the boundary, Ethan's mind was already racing. In the back of his head, the echoes of his military training urged him to document every detail. He retrieved his phone and began snapping photographs and taking notes, his resolve hardening with every click. Later that day, in a hastily arranged meeting with local officials, Ethan laid out his case. "The HOA's actions are not just overbearing, they're illegal," he argued, his voice steady yet impassioned. "I abide by the law, and I expect the same accountability from those enforcing it." The officials exchanged glances. Though many sympathized with his plight, the heavy hand of Karen's authority cast a long shadow over the proceedings. Back at the ranch, Karen's tactics grew bolder. "I have already notified the city's building inspectors," she declared during a brief phone conversation with a frustrated Ethan. "They will be arriving shortly to assess any additional discrepancies. You wouldn't want your property to be shut down, would you?" Her tone was icy and devoid of empathy. Despite the mounting pressure, Ethan stood his ground. "I welcome any inspection," he said. "Let them review the records. I'm confident that my property complies with every statute and regulation." Yet even as he spoke, he knew that Karen was orchestrating more than just routine checks. She was mobilizing the full weight of an HOA determined to force him into submission. That evening, as twilight descended over the land, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Ethan watched heart-pounding as more inspectors and even a couple of uniformed officers began to converge on his property. The once peaceful ranch was transforming into a siege zone, and Ethan realized that Karen's first power move was just the opening salvo in what would become an all-out assault on his way of life. In that charged atmosphere, every shadow and every whispered word from the inspectors deepened the chill that had settled in Ethan's bones. The battle lines were drawn between a man defending his legacy and an HOA that believed its overreaching authority could silence any dissent. And as the night fell, Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. He was prepared to fight every unwarranted fine, every bogus inspection, and every smirking admonition from Karen, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, the quiet determination that had once marked Ethan's mornings turned into a relentless pursuit of truth. Late one evening, As a storm gathered on the horizon, Ethan pored over stacks of municipal regulations and archived meeting minutes. The more he read, the more he discovered a disturbing pattern. Several of the HOA's so-called violations were based on fabricated infractions, and many of the fines levied seemed designed to extract money rather than ensure safety or aesthetic order. A knock at the door startled him from his research. When he opened it, a nervous-looking HOA board member, whose name was rarely mentioned in hushed conversations, leaned in close. "Mr. Carter," the board member whispered, glancing over his shoulder as though afraid of being overheard, "I've seen what Karen's been doing. The fines, the inspections, they're not just about rules. She's using the HOA funds to pay for personal expenses. I can't say more, but you're not the only one suffering." This clandestine tip ignited a spark of rebellion within Ethan. Armed with a discreet digital recorder and a camera hidden in the folds of his jacket, he began to document every irregularity. Days turned into weeks as he recorded heated phone calls, recorded meetings, and even managed to capture a heated argument between Karen and a fellow board member, one who questioned the legitimacy of some of her draconian measures. During one such encounter at a community event held in the local park, Ethan watched as Karen confronted a group of residents over a minor landscaping issue. "If you can't maintain your property to the required standard," she declared with a venomous edge, "then you're jeopardizing the entire neighborhood's image." The residents, normally amiable and cooperative, began murmuring among themselves, their discontent bubbling to the surface. Determined to expose the corruption festering within the HOA, Ethan began reaching out to local journalists and civic leaders. His findings were undeniable. Karen had not only been issuing arbitrary fines, but had also been misusing funds meant for community improvements. The documents he gathered, annotated meeting minutes, misappropriated receipts, and audio recordings of incriminating conversations, painted a damning portrait of abusive power. But as Ethan's evidence mounted, so did Karen's desperation. One morning, he awoke to find a notice taped to his barn door stating that, due to unresolved compliance issues, the HOA was considering drastic measures, including the seizure of certain property rights. The notice was unsigned, but carried the unmistakable tone of finality. That evening, as Ethan sat at his desk reviewing the evidence with a heavy heart, he received a call from a trusted neighbor. "Ethan," the neighbor said quietly, "there's talk around here that Karen's been threatening to force homeowners off their property if they don't play by her rules. You're not alone in this fight." The community, once lulled into a state of passive acceptance by Karen's authoritative presence, was beginning to stir. Whispers of resistance, of taking a stand against the HOA's rampant overreach, spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Ethan's investigation was no longer a solitary crusade. It had become a rallying cry for every homeowner who had felt the sting of arbitrary power. Late that night, under the glare of a single desk lamp, Ethan made a decision. He would compile all his evidence into a dossier and present it at the next HOA meeting. This would be his counterattack, a definitive move to reveal the corruption that lay beneath Karen's polished exterior. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just fighting for his ranch. He was fighting for the very soul of the community. In the silence that followed, with the rumble of distant thunder echoing his resolve, Ethan realized that Karen's unchecked authority was on the verge of a collapse. The board members, who had long turned a blind eye, were beginning to whisper their doubts. And as Ethan prepared to unveil the truth, he knew that the coming confrontation would change everything. The HOA was no longer a benign institution. It was a ticking time bomb waiting to be defused by the collective will of a united community. The following week, a palpable tension hung over the community as the scheduled HOA meeting approached. Rumors swirled that Karen had planned a dramatic demonstration of her authority, a move designed to silence dissent once and for all. Ethan, armed with his meticulously compiled dossier of evidence, entered the packed community center with a quiet determination. Earlier that morning, as Ethan arrived at his ranch, he was confronted by an unsettling sight. His prized pickup, the workhorse that had hauled supplies and memories across rugged terrain, was gone. Instead, a tow truck sat idling near the gate, and a notice was affixed to the windshield. Unauthorized vehicle. Removal pending. Shocked and angered, Ethan immediately contacted the towing company, only to be met with vague explanations about non-compliance with HOA regulations. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics escalated in full view of the community. At the HOA meeting, she took center stage with her customary air of superiority. Effective immediately, she proclaimed, the HOA is initiating a new policy. In cases of persistent noncompliance, we reserve the right to shut off utilities and even file for temporary property seizure. A murmur of disbelief ran through the room. Homeowners exchanged incredulous glances. Many had lived in the neighborhood for years without ever suspecting that the rules could be so mercilessly enforced. Ethan's pulse raced as he stepped forward. With his dossier in hand, he calmly addressed the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "what you're about to see is not about petty disputes over aesthetics. It is about the corruption that has infiltrated our community." He flipped open the folder to reveal pages of documents, photographs, and audio transcripts that chronicled months of abuse. A hush fell over the room as Ethan detailed how Karen had repeatedly bypassed fair procedures, levying fines without proper notice, and even colluding with certain board members to cover up her misdeeds. "This is not merely an interpretation of our guidelines," he declared. "It's a blatant violation of the trust we as homeowners placed in our association." At first, Karen's face remained an impassive mask, but as the evidence mounted, the tension in the room became unbearable. A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Ethan and the red-faced president of the HOA. The community, long cowed by Karen's autocratic style, began to murmur in support of Ethan's claims. In a desperate bid to salvage control, Karen abruptly announced that any homeowner who refused to comply with the new policies would have their utilities disconnected at midnight. "I won't stand for rebellion," she hissed, her voice cracking with both anger and panic. "We are a community. Order is paramount." But her words, meant to instill fear, instead galvanized the crowd. One by one, residents recounted similar experiences, instances of unwarranted fines, baseless inspections, and intrusive measures that had upended their lives. The meeting room swelled with voices that, until now, had been silenced by fear. A respected elderly resident even rose to testify that the HOA's actions were nothing short of tyranny. At that moment, Karen's confident facade began to crumble. The very community she had sought to control was uniting against her, emboldened by Ethan's courage and the incontrovertible evidence he had presented. With every question from the attendees and every gasp at the damning records laid bare, it became clear that her authority was no longer unassailable. Though Karen attempted to deflect blame, accusing Ethan of fabricating evidence and twisting the rules to suit his personal vendetta, the tide was unmistakably turning. The meeting concluded in chaos, with many homeowners demanding a full inquiry into the HOA's practices and calling for Karen's immediate resignation. Outside the community center, as the night air carried the heated discussions and the sound of determined footsteps, Ethan felt a surge of vindication. He had struck back, not with violence or loud protest, but with truth and transparency. The battle for the soul of the neighborhood had truly begun, and the seeds of change were taking root in every heart present that evening. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, Karen's actions grew increasingly erratic. No longer able to rely on the unchallenged aura of authority, she resorted to desperate measures to reclaim control. One humid afternoon, as the heat shimmered over the barren parking lot of the community center, Karen did the unthinkable. She dialed 911. Her call was not to report a genuine emergency, but rather to allege that Ethan's ranch, with its aggressively bright security lights and unconventional layout, was causing a public disturbance. When the police arrived, the situation escalated further. The officers, expecting a typical neighborhood complaint, were met with Karen's frantic assertions of a safety hazard. "His property is out of control," she insisted, pointing toward the ranch as if it were a den of lawlessness. Ethan, who had been tending to repairs on the barn, heard the commotion and quickly made his way to the scene. With calm determination, he presented his city official badge and identification, clarifying that his ranch was fully compliant with local ordinances. "I'm a law-abiding citizen," he told the officers, his tone measured but firm. "There's no danger here, only a misunderstanding." But Karen was not done. In her desperation, she had secretly hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan, hoping to find some scandal or technicality to justify her actions. Late one night, while Ethan reviewed further documentation of the HOA's abuses, he caught a glimpse of something alarming on his security footage, a shadowy figure creeping around his garage. Over the next few days, the footage revealed indisputable evidence of the investigator trespassing on his property, rifling through personal documents, and even tampering with the security system. Armed with this evidence, Ethan took his battle to a new level. At the next community forum, he played the incriminating footage on a large screen, leaving little doubt that Karen's tactics had crossed the line into outright criminal behavior. Gasps and murmurs of disbelief echoed through the room as residents witnessed the private investigator's stealthy intrusion, a stark violation of privacy that underscored the lengths Karen was willing to go. "Enough is enough," Ethan declared, his voice echoing off the walls of the packed hall. "We trusted the HOA to protect our community, not to turn it into a personal fiefdom for one power-hungry individual." Karen's actions today prove that her agenda isn't about order, it's about control, and she'll stop at nothing to enforce her twisted vision. Karen, cornered and furious, attempted one final appeal. "I am only trying to preserve our standards," she shouted, her face flushed with indignation and panic. If that means taking extreme measures, then so be it. But her words rang hollow against the backdrop of irrefutable evidence. The police, who had initially arrived at her behest, now questioned her motives. One officer remarked quietly to another, "This isn't a public disturbance, it's harassment." In a moment that would mark the turning point of the entire ordeal, Ethan calmly recounted the numerous instances of overreach and abuse. Each fine, each baseless inspection, and now, the illegal trespassing. The community's support was palpable. Neighbors approached Ethan afterwards, offering words of gratitude and sharing their own stories of suffering under Karen's reign. As the pressure mounted, Karen's composure began to crack. The legal ramifications of her actions were imminent, and whispers of an investigation into the HOA's practices grew louder. With the damning evidence now on full display, even some of her most loyal board members began to distance themselves from her increasingly erratic behavior. That day, as Karen stormed out of the community center with tears of fury in her eyes, it was clear that her desperate gambit had backfired. In her attempt to silence Ethan and cement her authority, she had instead exposed her own vulnerability, a vulnerability that would ultimately lead to her downfall. The message was unmistakable. No amount of 911 calls or covert operations could override the truth, and the community was no longer willing to tolerate her oppressive tactics. In the wake of the explosive revelations, the community's unity coalesced into an unstoppable force for change. Within days, heated discussions on neighborhood forums and impassioned town hall meetings led to an unprecedented movement to reclaim the very essence of the community. Homeowners, once subdued by Karen's iron grip, began to stand up for their rights, demanding accountability and transparency. A special meeting was convened, a gathering that would decide the fate of the HOA and, by extension, Karen's reign. Ethan arrived early, carrying his dossier as both shield and sword, ready to witness the long-overdue reckoning. The atmosphere inside the meeting hall was charged. Residents whispered eagerly, sharing memories of past injustices and expressing hope for a future free from tyranny. At the meeting's outset, a surprise vote was announced. "We will now decide whether Karen Pritchard should remain as president of the HOA," the interim moderator declared, his voice trembling with both anticipation and resolve. The room fell silent as each homeowner cast their vote, a symbolic gesture that, by the count, sealed Karen's fate. With overwhelming support for her removal, the vote was unanimous. Karen's tenure was officially terminated, and a motion was passed to launch a full-scale investigation into the HOA's operations. Outside the hall, the reaction was euphoric. Neighbors embraced, some shedding tears of relief, while others exchanged handshakes that spoke of renewed hope. The very institution that had once loomed as an unyielding monolith of control was now crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. In the days that followed, the city's authorities moved decisively. The HOA was slapped with substantial fines for illegally enforcing non-existent rules, and several board members were summoned for questioning regarding their complicity in misappropriating funds. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the scandal was the subject of community meetings, local news segments, and even social media rants. Karen, now a pariah in the eyes of the neighborhood, found herself isolated. Her once imposing front had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, isolated figure scrambling for any semblance of control. Rumors spread that her house would be forced on the market and that her personal assets were at risk of seizure. Even the legal representatives who had once defended her were distancing themselves, wary of becoming entangled in a case that had grown far beyond a mere property dispute. Ethan, though weary from the long battle, savored the bittersweet taste of victory. He took no pleasure in Karen's ruin, but rather in the restoration of justice and the reclamation of his home. Sitting on his newly restored porch under a starlit sky, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This isn't just my win, he thought. It's a win for all of us who believe that fairness and community matter. In the aftermath, the HOA board was overhauled, with new members elected from among the residents, people who were dedicated not to imposing arbitrary rules, but to fostering a supportive, transparent community. The investigations continued, and legal experts assured everyone that the full consequences of the HOA's malpractices were yet to come. But for the moment, the oppressive force that had once loomed over the ranch had been dismantled piece by piece. Karen's public humiliation was complete when, at a subsequent neighborhood gathering, she was forced to address her misdeeds in front of a united front of disillusioned residents. Her attempts to defend her actions were met with cold stares and curt dismissals. Even as she mumbled apologies and tried to justify her actions as necessary for maintaining standards, the damage was irrevocable. The community no longer recognized her as their leader. As the sun rose on a new day for the neighborhood, Ethan looked out over his ranch, a place that had weathered not just storms of nature, but a tempest of human ambition and greed. The victory was not without scars, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where property rights, personal dignity, and the freedom to live without undue interference were finally respected. And as he sipped his morning coffee on a porch bathed in gentle light, Ethan knew that justice, however delayed, had indeed prevailed. In the weeks following the dramatic vote, the full force of the law descended on the remnants of the old HOA. City officials, spurred on by public outcry and the mounting evidence of mismanagement, launched a comprehensive investigation into the association's operations. The inquiry revealed systemic abuses, from exorbitant fines levied without due process to the misappropriation of funds meant for community improvements. A series of lawsuits was soon filed by a coalition of homeowners, led in large part by Ethan, whose steadfast determination had become emblematic of the community's fight for justice. Legal experts weighed in, asserting that the HOA had operated in clear violation of municipal and state regulations. The case quickly gained traction, attracting local media attention and inspiring other communities to re-examine their own governance structures. As court dates were set and discovery began in earnest, several board members were subpoenaed to explain their roles in the mismanagement. The once feared institution of the HOA was now under the microscope. Financial audits uncovered alarming discrepancies. Funds that should have been allocated to community projects were instead diverted to Karen's personal accounts and lavish expenditures. Ethan's final power move came during a town hall meeting organized by the city council. Standing before a room filled with expectant residents, he presented the culminating evidence of the HOA's malfeasance, meticulously organized charts, bank statements, and affidavits from former board members who had grown disillusioned with the corrupt practices. We entrusted these individuals with our hard-earned money and the welfare of our community, he declared. It is time for accountability, not excuses. The legal proceedings progressed swiftly. Within a matter of weeks, the court imposed hefty fines on the HOA, and an order was issued to dissolve the organization entirely. For many, this was more than a legal victory. It was a restoration of faith in the system, a reaffirmation that no one was above the law. In the final courtroom showdown, as the judge pronounced the verdict, the atmosphere was electric with relief and vindication. The ruling not only mandated the dissolution of the corrupt HOA, but also required that a portion of the misappropriated funds be returned to the community through a trust fund dedicated to neighborhood improvements. For the residents, this was a tangible measure of restitution, a sign that their struggles had not been in vain. Even as the legal dust settled, the ripple effects of the case continued to be felt. Other communities began to re-examine their own rules and the extent to which power could be abused under the guise of communal welfare. Ethan emerged not merely as a local hero, but as a symbol of resistance, a reminder that when citizens unite in pursuit of justice, even the most entrenched institutions can be held accountable. As the HOA crumbled and legal proceedings took their toll on the association's former leadership, Karen Pritchard found herself facing a series of personal and professional catastrophes. No longer insulated by power and prestige, she became a cautionary tale of what happens when entitlement meets accountability. Within days of the court's ruling, Karen's world began to unravel. The once proud figure who had ruled over the neighborhood with an iron fist now found herself isolated. Her personal finances, scrutinized under the relentless lens of the investigation, revealed a trail of extravagance and mismanagement. Rumors spread like wildfire. Her car was repossessed, her credit score plummeted, and even her long-held membership in exclusive clubs was revoked. In the public eye, Karen's fall was swift and brutal. At a community event intended to celebrate the new beginning of the HOA-free neighborhood, she made an unexpected appearance, desperate to salvage what remained of her dignity. However, the reception was icy. Whispers and sideways glances followed her every step. When a resident boldly remarked, "I hope you enjoy following the rules now," a bitter smile flickered across her face, one that quickly turned to despair. Matters worsened when Karen's personal relationships began to crumble. Her husband, embittered by years of living in the shadow of her relentless ambition, filed for divorce. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. In a final public display of humiliation, she was forced to resign from her position as an advisor to another local HOA, a role that now seemed laughably ironic. Ethan, although resolute and measured in his own actions, couldn't help but feel a pang of poetic justice as news of Karen's downfall spread. He encountered her one last time on a rainy afternoon outside City Hall, where she attempted to lodge a feeble complaint against the very system she had once dominated. With a simple, measured nod, Ethan said, "I hope you find peace in following the rules this time." Her eyes, once blazing with unyielding authority, now shone with the bitter light of defeat. For many in the neighborhood, Karen's downfall was more than a personal tragedy. It was a watershed moment that symbolized the triumph of accountability over arrogance. Her story served as a reminder that no one, regardless of their stature, was immune to the consequences of abuse and corruption. In the quiet moments that followed, as the community began to heal from the scars of injustice, the name Karen Pritchard gradually faded from whispered conversations and angry tirades. It became a byword for entitlement, a relic of an era best left behind. Months passed since the dramatic upheaval that had rocked the community, and a gentle calm began to settle over the once tumultuous neighborhood. Ethan Carter, now a revered figure in the community, stood on the porch of his reclaimed ranch, a symbol of resilience and hard-fought freedom. The air was crisp and clear, filled with the familiar sense of fresh earth and wild sage, and the scars of past battles were slowly healing into stories of triumph. Neighborhood gatherings resumed, this time with a spirit of unity and camaraderie. Residents met not to complain about arbitrary fines or petty infractions, but to celebrate the newfound transparency and fairness that now defined their community. At a local picnic held on the expansive lawn of the community center, laughter replaced tension. Children ran freely along the dirt paths, and elders shared tales of the days when silence was the norm, a time when one person's overreach had threatened the heart of their home. Ethan, sitting comfortably with a cup of coffee in hand, observed the scene with a quiet smile. A friend approached him, half-jokingly handing him a mock violation notice for having an excess of genuine joy on his property. With a twinkle in his eye, Ethan replied, "I guess I'll have to pay the fine, if it means I can keep living like this." The room erupted in laughter, a laughter that signified not just relief, but a complete reversal of fortunes. As dusk settled over the ranch one final time, the community gathered for a symbolic closing of the tumultuous chapter. At a small ceremony by the old oak tree, residents placed tokens of remembrance, a simple plaque, handwritten notes, and even a few mementos dedicated to the days of injustice and the hard-won victory that followed. It was a celebration of resilience, of the idea that a community united can transform even the darkest conflict into a beacon of hope. For Ethan, the journey had been arduous, filled with setbacks and moments of despair, but also with the quiet dignity of standing by one's beliefs. His ranch, once threatened by the intrusive hand of an overreaching HOA, was now a testament to the power of truth and the unwavering spirit of community. In that gentle twilight, as the final vestiges of Karen's reign faded into memory, Ethan felt a deep sense of closure. The screen of life, as if drawing the final curtain, faded to black with one final mic drop moment, a reminder that when entitlement is challenged, justice prevails. The legacy of the battle would be told for years to come, not as a story of bitterness, but as an enduring lesson that no one should ever be allowed to trample on the sanctity of another's home. And as Ethan watched the stars emerge in the clear night sky, he knew that the future belonged to those who dared to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Fade to black. The end.